Good evening and welcome. My name is William Jones. I'm the state's attorney for Dorchester County, and I'd like to thank you for taking the time tonight to either join us live or perhaps watch a rebroadcast or recording of this show sometime after tonight. Excuse me. Tonight we're going to do something a bit unusual. This is the second in our three-part series on criminal justice and justice here in Dorchester County. And when I say we're going to do something different, it's because if you recall last time, we talked about the Maryland Criminal Intelligence Network and what that is statewide and what that is here in Dorchester County in terms of attempts to drive down violent crime, to identify, disrupt, dismantle criminal organizations. And as we were putting this series together, we realized that we spent a lot of time talking about juvenile justice. And when we did that in all of our conversations, us as a coalition, we realized that juvenile justice is something that is incredibly important, but it doesn't get a lot of attention nationwide, statewide, Dorchester County, as it were. And we thought that maybe we could devote an entire hour talking about juvenile justice. And to that end, what we propose to do tonight is talk about this intersection, if you will, of juvenile justice and the Maryland Criminal Intelligence Network. Now, does that mean that the Maryland Criminal Intelligence Network is something that targets juveniles or children or something like that? Absolutely not. But what we know is that there is this relationship between juveniles and the rest of the justice system. And that includes not just the small types of things, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but it's an issue that has serious consequences for the community. And for that reason, that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Now, we have three guests tonight. In a moment, I'll be introducing each of them to you. We have Sergeant Antoine Patton of the Cambridge Police Department joining us. We have Regional Director Corey Fink from the Department of Juvenile Services. And finally, we have Assistant State's Attorney Laura Chafee of the Dorchester County State's Attorney's Office. Laura, there on your screen, actually works in my office. I have the privilege of working with all three. And tonight you'll have a chance to hear about from all of them and what they do in juvenile justice in general. Now, as I said, this is the second in a three-part series that is designed to talk about justice in general, public safety in general, and how the various agencies in Dorchester County work together to make this a great place to live, work, and play. So if you have a question, excuse me, you would like for us to address, please enter it in the chat feature, and we'll get to as many as we can. Last week, last time we met, I didn't quite get to as many questions as I'd hoped, and I'll try to do a little better job of that tonight. If we can't answer your question, we will try to follow up and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Either directly, we'll communicate with you, get that answer to you, or we'll circle back when we meet again. As I said, this is the second in a three-part series. And we're changing this up a little bit. What we did first envisioned was a three-part series just on MCIN, the Maryland Criminal Intelligence Network. And we thought that all three shows would really go into great detail, if you will, in terms of how all of these things fit together in terms of the governor's MCIN program. But we covered a lot of that last time. And this time we realized that, that the two aren't necessarily melded together. We're going to talk about the relationship between the two, but we're also going to talk about how juvenile justice is just a little different. And the guests tonight are going to talk about that. And what I think we're going to do is we're going to take our third show, our third program, and change that from an MCIN show to more of a wrap-up of all things criminal justice, public safety here in Dorchester County. We think that some good things came out of our last show. We expect some good things to come out of this show. And so we will move away from it being an MCIN focus and just sort of talk about all sorts of things. Maybe that's community-based corrections. We can talk about a little bit of law enforcement reform. Certainly there's been a lot of that going on in Annapolis and nationwide this year. So we'll have a chance to talk about those things as well. Now, if you recall from our last program, the Maryland Criminal Intelligence Network is a statewide program. It's coordinated and funded by the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services. It's a long title, but they do great work coming out of Annapolis for us. Now, what this program is something that's funded and coordinated through several jurisdictions throughout Dorchester County. Throughout the state of Maryland. Dorchester County is one of those locations. Now, the heart of the program is collaboration and comprehensive data sharing. The belief is that these criminal networks and organizations and enterprises are organizations just like any other. And they communicate, and there's a lot of data that goes back and forth. And that's within an organization, that's among organizations. And the belief is that that type of data sharing and collaboration allows law enforcement and all of our criminal justice partners to have a much better idea in terms of what's going on in their jurisdictions, what's going on in other jurisdictions. You heard from our last show about the travel of criminal activity from here, Wycomico County, Sussex, Delaware, Philadelphia, DC, Baltimore. And so the belief is that if we share data better, we collaborate better, then hopefully what we will see is that we are more effective in driving down violent crime. That's our ultimate goal, right? We want to make all of our communities safer places to live, better places to live. And if you don't have safety, you don't have anything. For those of you who don't know, a really long time ago, I was a police officer. And I'll never forget, the second day of the police academy, we had this professor came in and taught from the University of Virginia. And she said, if you don't have safety and security, you don't have anything. If you can't leave your house, you have no freedom if you don't live in a safe environment. And that's really what this is. We want everybody to live free, happy lives. But it all starts with an orderly and safe place. So we're very thankful to Governor Hogan and his Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services for funding us, for coordinating with us. And we're hoping that tonight we have a chance to talk about how some of these issues do come together. And we'll talk about the justice system as it relates to juveniles as well, because that really is a very different system. And a lot of people don't understand just how that works. So when we talk about juvenile justice, and crimes committed by juveniles, or what we like to say is acts committed by juveniles that would be a crime if committed by an adult. We often think of these nuisance crimes like shoplifting or destruction of property, maybe minor drug possession, alcohol possession, things like that. And what happens is people think that generally that's just sort of what it is, that we don't have all of the other violent crime relationships with children that we see. They don't think that murder, robbery, serious sex offenses, things like that exist among the youth population. They may not necessarily understand or know that there's participation in gangs and other criminal organizations by juveniles. And so we're hoping that we can, figure some of these things out. And one of the things you have to understand is that adult justice tends to start at the age of 18. We as a society have drawn this bright line and said that if you are 17 years, 364 days old, you are a juvenile, and the juvenile system will treat anything that comes along. But once you've hit your 18th birthday, we're going to make you an adult. And what we know is that nothing, bright lines don't work. The law likes bright lines because that's a starting point, but that's not just a safe way to always move forward and understand the analysis of these things. So think about it like this. There's not a lot of difference between an 18-year-old and a 17-and-a-half-year-old in terms of development and everything else. And so it doesn't really make sense to believe that everything committed up until the age of 18 is not a big deal. 18 thereafter, it is in fact a big deal. We see even right here in Dorchester County, very young people, at the age of 14 sometimes, committing serious violent crimes. We've had shootings, attempted murders, serious sex offenses, robberies, things like that. And so it's a real thing. And, it's not just the commission of those crimes, but they truly are engaging in, some of these youths are engaging in organized activity. We don't like to use the word gangs because we don't like to label people, but a gang has a legal definition, a lawful definition. Sergeant Patton's familiar with that definition. And we should understand that our young people, unfortunately, engage in conduct that is criminal in nature and sometimes serious in nature. Here's the other thing we know. We know that youthful offenders sometimes, unfortunately, grow into adult offenders. And hopefully the goal of our juvenile justice system is to identify those children, figure out what it is that they need in their life. What intervention can we offer so that we can prevent a youthful offender from becoming an adult offender. We don't want the juvenile justice system to be just a training ground for the adult justice system. We're not going to be accomplishing a lot if that's what in fact we do. And so we're hoping that by addressing these children, these youth, and figuring out what it is in their lives that they need, then we can make a difference. And the group that we have before you tonight is here to talk about just those things. So with that, I've talked enough. It's probably time for you to hear from somebody else. So our first guest is Sergeant Antoine Patton of the Cambridge Police Department.
Good afternoon, Bill. Good afternoon, everyone.
Sergeant Patton, how are you this evening?
I am outstanding. Thanks for asking.
Good. Well, it's a pleasure to have you. I will tell our viewers that Sergeant Patton is a person I'm privileged to work with on a frequent basis. And when I hear from him or happen to run into him, you can't deal with him without leaving with a smile on your face. Just can't do it. So, Sergeant, tell us, what is it you do for the Cambridge Police Department?
I am the sergeant of our community policing division, and we believe at the Cambridge Police Department that we are an outreach department, and we pride ourselves in community policing. We do things, partners not only with youth, but also with adults. We partner with different people in our community. In my 20 years of being here, I don't think that there was ever a time where we neglected to partner with someone to have an event or to do community outreach. We work with different organizations such as the Pond Street Committee. We work a lot with Dr. Stafford and her family there at the New Beginnings. We're getting ready to collaborate with the Boys and Girls Club here in Cambridge. We have a police athletic league in which we do conjunction with the Dorchester County Public Schools. And each holiday, we also try to do a community outreach event so we can have our children involved on the holidays when they're outside of school. And during the summertime, we do a lot of presentations and things like that for our community, such as bicycle safety, gun safety, violence prevention, movie nights. As a matter of fact, Bill, I think we're trying to come together and have a movie night as school comes to an end. And then during the holidays, like I said, Halloween, we do our trunk or treat, which is very popular. We normally have about 1,100 kids and family members there for the trunk or treat. And Thanksgiving, we actually do the food giveaway, which we do every year, and a Shot with a Cop program during Christmas. And right now we're in the process of doing cadet programs. We wanted to have a juvenile cadet program with the middle school children and actually a high school cadet program. And this is something that's new that we're going to try to do. And the high school cadet program to influence children to go into law enforcement. And for those who want to go into law enforcement, once they get out of high school, they can stay in this program and actually be a part of the Cambridge Police Department and be a paid employee until it's time for them to go to the police academy.
Really? Wow. I'd like to follow up on a couple of those things right there, because that was a lot of really valuable information. And I'm just going to pick one of those for a moment. The Boys and Girls Club. What can you tell me about that? In terms of the program, what that looks like.
The Boys and Girls Club is a program. It's actually from Baltimore, the Boys and Girls Club of Baltimore. The plan is for them to operate out of the old Nautilus building, which was purchased by the county for the old racket club there on Leonard's Lane. And the Boys and Girls program is going to run Monday through Friday, 3 to 7. So after the children who elect to go there, they come there after school. They do studying, they do their homework. They have a computer lab there, which is available to all the children with internet. So homework, things of that nature. And also after that, some kind of recreational activity.
So what is it about those hours of 3 to 7 that you all focus on, to where you think that is a key time to provide some of these services?
Well, historically through the week, 3 to 7 is our peak hours for juvenile crime, because they're just getting out of school and a lot of times their parents aren't home yet. So they have that window of opportunity there, or that time to find mischief.
Wow. Okay. And then the Police Athletic League, what does that look like?
Police Athletic League, that's an after school program that we do. Because of COVID this year, we weren't able to do it this year, but that's a program designed and based to build community relations with our children, because we want them to have positive interactions with us, not just bad interactions when they see the police department. And that is from 3 to 5 when school's over as well.
So let's talk about that, because you throw that out there. It's great to provide these services. Mm-hmm. And what you are is providing sort of like a stopgap. You see a need, you talk about the children from the times of 3 to 7, and you realize that there's a need there. These kids need a little bit of structure. They need something, put into their lives. And we don't often think of the police department as being the one that would be sort of that gap filler. Why do you think it is that the police department does that? And how does that ultimately help you all do your jobs in terms of building these relationships with these kids?
Well, if you think about it, the kids that we deal with today will be the adults that we deal with several years ago. Me being here 20 years now, the children that I taught in Dare 15, 16 years ago are now growing up. So those are who we deal with. And if one was to watch the news and social media and listen to the radio and had no interactions with police at all, they would think that police are actually, we're all terrible and horrible people, which is not the truth at all. So that's why we do a lot of the community outreach to have these positive interactions with our community and our children.
Do you find that your positive interactions with these kids that you dealt with 10, 15, 20 years ago pays dividends now when you have new contact with some of the people you knew as kids?
Absolutely. We build trust with those children when they're younger, and you'd be surprised the amount of children who are adults now who have issues that will come and contact us and call. Hey, do you remember me? This is what I have going on now. Could you help me out? And there's times where we get letters from children who are off into college and say, hey, this is the reason why I'm here. This is the reason why I'm studying this, from something that we did when I was a kid.
That has to be rewarding.
It is.
And then finally, and before I move on to a couple other things, the cadet program, you mentioned that, underrepresentation of certain communities within our overall community, within law enforcement, is a problem, right? And historically, we would prefer for law enforcement to be reflective of our communities. Is there any belief that the cadet program will be helpful in that regard in terms of attracting more minority applicants who are qualified and ready to go out there and serve their communities?
Absolutely. Historically, when we hire at the Cambridge Police Department, there is a lot of people apply that are not from our community. And hopefully with the cadet program, we can have homegrown children who are our children who live in our community, who will want to come back and actually police in our community.
Makes a big difference, doesn't it?
Absolutely, because they know the community, they know the people, and people are apt to talk to people who they trust and who they know.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here and talk about what you see on a daily basis in terms of criminal activity. Can you describe for a moment what you see within the community in terms of the children, the youth, juveniles, and their participation in some of our organized criminal activity that we see?
If you look at our data, the numbers appear to have grown in our juvenile numbers and juvenile arrests. The incidents are the same, but what we look at, there's more juveniles and crimes lumped together now. Normally in the past, we'd have one juvenile would get arrested for something, but now we found that they're involved in organized crime. For instance, our car thefts were up in 2020. I believe we had 16 car thefts in 2020. And if you look at it, they aren't juveniles by themselves that were actually committing the crime. It was 4 or 5 of them together actually committing the crime. Same thing with violent offenders. We have assaults now where we have 4 or 5, or maybe sometime maybe up to 10 kids in one big fight instance. So there is organized crime amongst our juveniles.
So I teased it a moment ago when I talked about the definition of a gang. And I teased it because I knew that you had it sort of right there, the tip of your tongue. So what in your mind is the definition that we use for a gang?
Well, the textbook definition of a gang that we go by is 3 or more people, juveniles or adults, together committing a crime. And if you actually look at that definition, there are juvenile gangs, if you look at the definition, which are 3 or more together committing a crime.
Now, are these always like formal gangs like we see if we're coming out of Baltimore or LA or something like that? Or do they sometimes have a less formal structure about them, but still organized structure?
Less formal structure, because they're normally all friends that hang out together. So you'd have one group of children that hang in one part of the city, or another group of children who live in another part of the city who actually hang together, and then they're committing their crimes together.
Now, I'd heard something about this once before. Are you familiar with this concept of some of our adult gangs or adult criminal networks utilizing youthful offenders to do sort of their dirty work, sort of like be their soldiers for them?
Absolutely. We started noticing that trend several years ago, where we were arresting some juvenile, and it come to find out that they were committing the crimes for someone who was in another group or organization. And it's sad that we have adults in our community who would lure kids to commit crimes for them. For instance, one time we had a group of cars that were getting broken into, 20 or 30 cars that were getting broken into through a week span. And what we realized, that they were breaking into cars and stealing things out of these vehicles to take to an adult.
So why would the adults explain to our viewers why they would utilize children basically to do that dirty work for them?
They realize that, as you stated earlier, that children commit criminal acts as adults commit crimes. So they feel as though that their children will get less time than they do because they're a juvenile, and they go into the juvenile offender. They go to juvenile services instead of coming to the state's attorney's office.
So is it fair to say that locally, like our MCIN program isn't something that's focused on juveniles, but the concept is still there, that we're still looking at organizations and trying to figure out how to not only identify them, but sort of stop the work that they are doing and basically dissolve the organizations?
Absolutely, absolutely, because they're using the children to do their crimes. So if we use the MCIN money and the networking that we're doing, we can catch the children who are committing the crimes, and then we could catch the adults who are getting these children to actually commit the crimes.
And ultimately take down these adult organizations that are using these kids.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So has there been a trend lately? Because I know what it feels like, right? Sometimes you get a certain sense of things. And I would ask you, is there a sense lately that our trends are such that our youthful offenders are committing more serious crimes now, the shootings, the things like that?
Yes, and we know that our children are like sponges and they mimic what they see. So if you look at the adult crime, if the adult crime goes up, your juvenile crime and juvenile offenders are going to go up because they're mimicking the actions from what they see from the adults.
And that includes, I guess, suppose in some cases, and Laura and Corey are going to talk about that as well, but the Cambridge Police Department, as I understand it, has some juveniles charged as adults with crimes because of the seriousness of the offenses they've committed.
Absolutely. Recently, in the last several months, we've had juveniles actually charged as adults for some shootings, some serious sexual crimes or rapes, and a bank robbery. We had juveniles involved in a bank robbery who also were with adults at the time of the bank robbery who were now charged with as adults.
Wow. Well, that's an incredible information that you shared with us, Sergeant, and I really appreciate that. I'm going to move on to our next guest, but I am confident you're going to stick around with us. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Good. I suspect that we're going to have other things to talk to you about as the program continues. So thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me.
So yeah, next I would introduce to you Corey Fink. Corey Fink from the Department of Juvenile Services is with us. There he is. Mr. Fink, please, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Good evening, Mr. Jones. Good to see you. So I am the regional director for the Eastern Shore. My responsibilities include overseeing and implementing both supervision and services for youth who are on probation or aftercare in the 9 counties, including Dorchester County here on the shore. Just one small tidbit, I got my start in supervision actually as the first full-time supervisor in Dorchester County back in 2006. So it's good to be with you guys tonight.
Well, it's really great to have you. So could you talk a little bit about the juvenile services role in this field and the juvenile justice system?
Sure. So we have many roles, from intake, which is receiving complaints from law enforcement, victims, or the school system, where allegations of delinquent acts are first brought to our attention. Our intake staff meet with the youth and their families. They assess the need for service referrals and ultimately decide on case processing. The agency as a whole operates juvenile detention centers and several committed facilities here in Maryland. We have a community detention unit who supervise youth that may be on community detention or electronic monitoring, or even on GPS. Our probation and aftercare staff, they monitor youth in the community, arrange for treatment services, and ensure ultimately that the youth comply with whatever conditions that the court imposes. We do conduct investigations on behalf of the courts. Those include social history investigations, waiver investigations, and/or transfers.
Wow, that's a lot on that plate there. My understanding is that you prepared a presentation that just with some visual aids to sort of walk through some of the juvenile justice system aspects from your perspective. Is that correct?
That is correct.
I would ask you to share that with our viewers at this time.
Sure. Be happy to. So the Maryland Department of Juvenile Services is an executive agency whose primary task is to appropriately manage, supervise, and treat youth who are involved in the juvenile justice system here in Maryland. Our mission, by law, we are a child serving agency who is responsible for assessing the individual needs of referred youth, and again, providing intake, detention, probation, commitment, and aftercare services. We collaborate with youth, their families, the school system, community partners, law enforcement, including my good friend Sergeant Patton, and other public agencies to coordinate services and resources to contribute to safer communities. The functions, as I talked about briefly, are many, including the intake, the detention, community detention, investigation, probation, pre-delinquent diversion, and that's often referred to as informal supervision. Those are kids who don't end up in the court system itself, but we are working to divert them from the actual court system. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the multiple functions that our agency performs. Organizationally, we are divided into 6 regions throughout the state of Maryland. Again, I'm the director for the 9 counties here on the Eastern Shore, which is pictured in the light blue. I do want to review some basic definitions because I think it's important to understand what those are to get a better understanding of the juvenile justice system as a whole. So a child is an individual under 18 years of age. A delinquent act is an act which would be a crime if committed by an adult. A delinquent child is a child who has 1, committed a delinquent act, and 2, the court has found that the youth requires their guidance, treatment, assistance, or rehabilitation. So they've been adjudicated delinquent, and the court has made that separate finding. So what are the steps in the juvenile justice system? As I alluded to earlier, our intake department receives complaints from law enforcement, schools, citizens, and parents. Some police departments run diversion programs, and only those youth who fail out of the program would then be referred to our agency. Law enforcement, upon making an arrest, can request emergency detention to determine if a youth should be detained in a secure facility pending further court action. If a youth is detained, they are required by law to appear in front of a judge or magistrate the next day that court is in session. So let's take a little deeper dive into the processes themselves. The intake complaint, again, a referral to our agency, is assessed by an intake officer who has statutory authority to determine how the case should be handled. The options are to disapprove as legally insufficient, which means there is no legal basis for the charge to be with our agency. They can resolve it at the intake level when it's determined that furthering the case would be disadvantageous to the interests of the youth and to public safety. We can place a youth by agreement on what's called the informal or pre-court supervision. It is a 90-day agreement initially to certain conditions without court involvement. Those can be extended for an additional 90 days if a youth is involved in behavioral health treatment, so substance abuse or mental health. Again, this is the main DJS court diversion program. The 4th option is to formally authorize the complaint, actually to your office, Mr. Jones, for the determination if a petition should be filed. Your office then reviews the complaint and you may decide not to file a petition, or you could go ahead and proceed in filing the petition within the juvenile court. Let's talk about the data. And I'm a big numbers guy, so that's probably the bulk of my presentation. We heard earlier that they had seen an increase in crime in Dorchester County. And this data goes from FY16, where we had a peak of 529, to FY 2020, where we received 389 complaints. It is important to note that law enforcement is our top referral source among all of our jurisdictions in the state of Maryland, but specifically in Dorchester, they account for 95%. But it is important to note that juvenile complaints are down 26.5% since FY16. The next slide, we're going to take a little deeper look into what types of offenses. As you alluded to in the introduction, you talked about crimes of violence or felonies. And what we have seen is that misdemeanor offenses account for more than 75% of the complaints here in Dorchester County. You can see in the bar graphs how many complaints we actually receive across those different spectrums of cases. So if people wanted more information, on our data, we do have a data resource guide that we publish annually, and it's also available on our website. So where are these offenses occurring within Dorchester County? You can see that the concentration is clearly in Cambridge, as well as Hurlock. So those are the two big population centers here in Dorchester County. As you can see, there are spread out as you get over to the Williamsburg and Fork area, which borders the state of Delaware. So you do have some crossover there. But this is just a map of the intakes that we received in fiscal year 2020, just giving it to you in a little different format on the map. So how do we handle the cases? More cases have been resolved while fewer formal petitions are filed. Case forwarding data reveals a decrease of nearly 50% in the rate of formal cases, while resolved cases have increased. So you can see in FY 2020, 198 cases were resolved, 50 were placed on pre-court supervision, and 141 were sent to the Office of the State's Attorney for consideration of formal petitioning. Again, those numbers have shown a decrease over the last several years. So taking a look at actual zip code data and where the youth resides, not necessarily where the offense occurs, the bulk of our youth, again, come from Cambridge. Again, the main population center here in Dorchester County. But it does give you a look that crimes do occur everywhere within the county. So what else does the data tell us? One of the alarming things that we are seeing is a growing number of females who are committing alleged delinquent offenses here in Dorchester County. You can see that that number has stayed about the same in FY 18 and 19, but then really peaked in FY 2020. As we mentioned, overall juvenile complaints are down, but there is one segment of the population that is growing, and that is among youth who are 13 and younger. You can see from the various slides from FY 16 to FY 2020 how those numbers are increasing. And increasing substantially, and that is of concern to all of us. Youth of color represent 51.6% of Dorchester County youth, but they account for more than 70% of the complaints that our office receives. You can see the breakdown illustrated here, with the Hispanic or other population accounting for 12, Caucasian or white being 89, and youth of color being 288 in FY 2020. As I alluded to earlier, we do publish an annual data resource guide, and that can be found on our website at djs.maryland.gov.
Not only helpful information, but there's some powerful information there that I would like to sort of break down a little bit. And, there are data people out there who really jump into the numbers, and I think it's important for us to maybe comment on that a little bit. So in terms of the overall reduction that you think that you would say that you've seen, what would you say about that? How would you describe that? What do you think is behind that?
That is probably the toughest question that we get across the agency. And this reduction is not unique to Dorchester County. It's not unique to Maryland. In fact, across the nation, they have seen a steady decline over the last decade or more in juvenile crime. I think if anybody knew the exact answer, they'd probably be on every talk show and radio show talking about it. But some of the things that we believe do contribute to it is changes in law enforcement practices, earlier identification and intervention, including diversion. Sergeant Patton talked about the Police Athletic League. Those have a huge impact on juveniles and their involvement or lack of involvement within the criminal justice system. You can go a step further, particularly around early identification of behavioral health, whether it's substance abuse or mental health, from an early elementary standpoint in that identification and linkage of services. Early Head Start, the local care team, they all lend to the overall decrease of juvenile crime.
And in terms of your zip code data, Cambridge and Hurlock, should the average viewer take from this that Hurlock and Cambridge are just not good places to be, or is there just more behind the numbers there that would explain why they would be what they are, where they are?
Sure, absolutely not. Cambridge and Hurlock are some of my favorite places to visit. Got family in both. So the issue is your population center. Where there are more people, there is a larger police presence versus outliers in the county, if you will. You also have your major school systems within those city or town jurisdictions. So that all lends to the numbers and the story behind the numbers, if you will, Bill.
So, maybe the most disturbing slide there was the one that broke down the representation by race. And there's no question that, I was asked this question a number of years ago when speaking at a in-person town hall, which I look forward to getting back to. And the question was about representation of people of color in the criminal justice system. And I remember saying, I don't have the numbers, but I can tell you that people of color are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. There's no two ways around that. And you have the numbers, you have the data. So what do you have to say about that? What's behind that? How do we address that? I mean, one of the reasons we decided to do another program was because I think that maybe we can go back and spend some more time talking about that. So from your perspective, what do you say about that overrepresentation?
So let's talk about the data for just a second. The percentages are calculated based on looking at the total population of youth within a given jurisdiction, right? And their rate of arrest, their rate of referral to the department, the rate of their being detained in a secure facility, the number of petition defenses, adjudicated petitions, as well as those that enter the deep end of our system. So they're removed from the home and placed outside of the home, whether it's in a foster care setting or a youth center that we own and operate or a hardware secure facility. The overall increase is concerning, and we'll continue to work with our community partners, our stakeholders, and other organizations to address this very issue. The department a few years ago actually created an Office of Race Equity, who conducts staff trainings. They are reviewing our policy and practices to mitigate the impact of disparate representation. And during the past year with COVID, we saw a huge decrease, particularly with youth being detained and youth of color being detained. We as an agency have objective decision-making tools and instruments that the agency uses also to try to mitigate the disproportionality numbers and percentages that we're seeing.
Could you follow up on that just for a second? I'm not sure that everyone will understand what that type of tool is. What type of information it factors into something so that a certain or a decision is made at the end?
Sure. So let's take our detention assessment instrument. We are looking at very specific measures. Race is not one of them. It shouldn't be. Gender is not one of them. But it's looking at the alleged offense, whether they've had prior contacts with the department, whether they've had prior failure to appear. Because secure detention in and of itself is designed to protect the child, the community, and to make sure that they appear for their court hearings. So that is the premise behind secure detention, and our detention instrument makes sure that we are appropriately detaining the right kids based on those factors, not subjective because somebody read a police report and saw a name and a race and said, oh, this offense, and decided to authorize the detention.
There's a comment to the side that basically says it's really disturbing that people of color are overrepresented. And we talked about this, when we prepared for this. Mm-hmm. And, we have to say that we have to own this. You can't hide from the numbers. You can't hide from the data. You can't hide from what would appear to be certain inequities. They are there. The question is, what do we do about it? Because if you don't own up to it, you're not going to be able to address it and fix that.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on that? How do we fix that? What do we do?
So I think there's a lot of different factors that play into it, right? We know how critical education is. And education in particular has a direct correlation with crime, whether it's committed by juveniles or by adults. So if kids aren't in school, then they have a propensity to have idle time on their hands and get involved in mischievous behavior. Some of that is normal adolescent behavior. Some of it rises to the level of criminal behavior. So One, making sure that kids are getting a quality education and that they are going to school. Kids that get a high school diploma versus dropping out of school. Kids that have post-secondary education, even if it's vocational training. College graduates, particularly among youth of color. When they meet those achievements, the propensity or likelihood of involvement within the juvenile system or the criminal justice system dramatically is reduced. So it's about making sure that all of our kids have access, one, equitable and fair opportunity. So all that lends to economics, prosperity, and opportunity through employment, vocational training, housing, healthcare. All of those things play a role in the overall criminal justice system, but particularly with the juvenile justice system.
I really can't thank you enough for addressing that, because that's not an easy question to answer. We as a society are grappling with that. And I agree with you. It starts with so many things: the economics, access to education, opportunity, everything. So it all factors together. So I really appreciate you doing that. Now, you talked about intake a moment ago, and we have a question from a viewer that says, does the average person know they can file a juvenile complaint? Can you talk about that for a second and what that is?
Sure. So if somebody believes that they have had a delinquent act committed against them, most people would typically call law enforcement and report that offense. If they don't feel comfortable contacting law enforcement, they can come into our office and fill out what's called a juvenile complaint form. However, there are certain legal criteria that has to be met. So we have to have the kid's name, their date of birth, their address, the nature of the alleged offense. We don't go out and investigate the allegation. We're relying on that referral or juvenile complaint form to provide that information to us. So typically, and again, I think the data showed 95% of our complaints come from law enforcement.
Okay. Well, that's I think something that the average person doesn't understand, and I really appreciate the question being tossed out to us, because people don't necessarily understand they can go right to juvenile services and initiate that process. What do you see in terms of juvenile and their involvement in criminal organizations and networks from a DJS perspective?
So I think historically speaking, and probably still today, the use of juveniles in the drug trade in particular, whether they serve as lookouts, people who would hold for dealers in large quantities, lower level street dealers, up to their involvement with coordinated robberies of delivery drivers. And, you know, Sergeant Patton mentioned the most recent bank robbery that occurred in Cambridge.
Right. And, you know, it's funny you say that, because the average adult who is possessing drugs with the intent to distribute them faces a potential 20-year prison sentence. Mm-hmm. The average juvenile does not. And it's a straight up exposure issue there. So another question, you know, I wanted to talk about criminal networks, gangs, things like that in our adult prison systems. Is that an issue that DJS has been on the lookout for in your detention facilities?
Absolutely. And we have been for quite some time. The department has an Office of the Inspector General who is charged with investigating alleged gang involvement. Again, the state has adopted standards in which one has to meet to be a confirmed gang member. Our staff, including our community staff, are trained on gang awareness, including local gangs, cultures, signs, and histories. I can tell you that it's not as big of an issue within the juvenile system as they see in adult corrections.
And you're on the lookout for it, for sure, though.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Corey, I can't thank you enough. You've really, sort of like Antoine did, shared a lot of information. Are you able to stick around for a few more minutes? Because after Laura, I think we might have some more questions for you.
Look forward to it.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bill.
So, next, we have Laura Chafee. Laura is an assistant state's attorney for Dorchester County. There's Laura. I have the privilege of seeing with Laura, working with Laura every day. Laura, how long have we worked together now?
A little over 6 years.
That's been a great 6 years, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So what is it you do for the state's attorney's office? Because I think that people would be interested to hear the sort of the hats that you wear for me in there.
So I am primarily the juvenile court prosecutor. So I handle all of the juvenile cases that come through Dorchester County. I also work with the drug court program and the veterans court program. So I guess you could say I'm the specialty court prosecutor for Dorchester, and I also sit on the MCIN team as well.
Okay, so you are doubly purposed here tonight, and appropriately so. Well, I
Yeah.
appreciate you taking your evening to come out and hang out with us. So how does the state's attorney's office fit within this juvenile justice system?
So as we heard a little bit earlier, when a juvenile commits a delinquent act, the police or a citizen can refer that to the Department of Juvenile Services. If the department determines they want to forward that on for possible court action, then it comes to me. I review that case. I determine are the charges legally sufficient? Do I have enough evidence to pursue this case? What does the victim say? Does the victim want to pursue the case? Is there restitution owed? So those are all the things I look at. And if I decide that it is appropriate for court action, I will then file an official petition with the court to be heard in front of the juvenile court. And also,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
once there is a case in juvenile court, if the kid is found delinquent and in need of the court's guidance, I work with DJS on helping to provide services for that kid. What brought them into the system? What can we do to help essentially get them out of the system and becoming a better member of society?
I got a little long-winded talking to Corey because he had so much information, but I understand that you've got a presentation that you've done to sort of talk about the system and particularly how it differs. So I would ask you to sort of walk us through that a little bit so the average person understands the difference, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. So the main difference between the adult system and the juvenile system is probably their goals. The juvenile system is more geared towards guidance, treatment, and rehabilitation, whereas we know the adult system is more punishment and preventing future crimes and keeping the community safe. So in the adult system, most people are familiar. You have a police arrest or you have a citizen complaint that goes to the commissioner. Then that case comes to our office, the state's attorney's office. We look at that case, make sure it's legally sufficient. If it's not, sometimes we dismiss the case and then the case is closed. If we decide to pursue it, it then goes to court. At that point, the defendant can take a plea or we can go to trial. They can be found not guilty and then that case ends right then and there. If they take a plea or if we have trial and they're found guilty, then we go on to the sentencing phase. And for example, adult sentencing is very different from juvenile sentencing. In adult court, you may have a sentence of 2 years, suspend 1 year with 2 years supervised probation. So you're having the person spend approximately a year in jail, then they're released, and then they're on probation for 2 years, and then their case goes away. And we'll learn a little bit later how this is very different from the juvenile system. So as you can see, this is a juvenile system flow chart. What happens when a juvenile commits a crime? Again, you have a police referral or you have a citizen complaint, and then that goes to the Department of Juvenile Services. That goes to Mr. Fink in his office. And again, like he said, they do an intake. They determine whether the case can be closed. Sometimes they'll keep it in formal pre-court supervision with them, or they'll refer it to me at the state's attorney's office. Again, state's attorney's office can decide to not charge. We can also send it back to DJS if we think that informal pre-court supervision is more appropriate for that case. We can send it back to DJS. So there's lots of steps that have to be taken that adults don't take when a juvenile commits a crime. It goes through several different obstacles to actually get to court and get to be formally charged. And some considerations, as Mr. Fink said before, their age, their history with the department, the victim, is there restitution, what injuries are caused, what's the severity of the crime. So all those things go into consideration when I decide, am I going to forward something to court? Is it worth going to court, or can we just end it here? And also, we talked a lot about juveniles in Dorchester County being charged as adults. Juveniles can be charged as an adult. However, it must fall under specific criteria. So if a juvenile is 16 years or older and they commit a certain act, they can be charged as an adult. And so you have of course, your murder, rape, firearm offenses, assault first degree. So you can read that list there. But also, if they are charged as an adult, that's not necessarily that they're going to be convicted as an adult. They have an opportunity to try and waive back to juvenile court, or transfer back to juvenile court. And then vice versa, if a kid is charged in juvenile court and the state's attorney's office decides, no, we want them charged as an adult, we can also ask the court to waive them up to adult court. So nothing's totally set in stone until the judge has the last say, but typically that's how juveniles get charged as adults. So when a case does come to the circuit court sitting as a juvenile court, that's when I file a formal petition. You have an adjudication, which is equivalent to a trial in the adult system. And for some reason, the juvenile court uses different terms for trials and sentencing and guilty and not guilty. So we'll go through those. So at this trial, they can have a contested trial. They can be found not involved or not guilty, and then the case is closed. They can be found involved, which is the equivalent to guilty, or they can also admit their involvement, which is equivalent to a plea. And then what happens is we don't typically have sentencing right then and there, which you see in adult court a lot. You actually have this approximately 30-day period where the Department of Juvenile Services does a social history investigation and determines what they think is the appropriate disposition or sentence for the kid. And they can come back and say, well, the kid's not delinquent. They don't need the court's guidance or treatment or rehabilitation. The parents have it under control. And then the case can be closed then. The department can determine probation, supervised probation with the department is appropriate. And then the ultimate, sanction would be commitment to the Department of Juvenile Services. And as we'll learn later, that can be either community-based or non-community-based. And also the juvenile court does have jurisdiction over juveniles 16 years or older that commit traffic offenses that are punishable by incarceration. So driving without a license carries 1 year. DUIs, fleeing and eluding, those traffic offenses also for juveniles over 16 do come to the court.
I'm going to push you forward a little bit and ask you to talk about probation. What sort of probationary terms do these kids sometimes have placed upon them?
So, of course, we have the supervision of the department. So they will have to report to their agent, however often the agent believes is appropriate. Of course, now I believe that's mostly by phone due to COVID. Substance abuse treatment, mental health treatment, curfews, obey the household rules of your parents. Anything that the court thinks that they need, attend school, no unexcused absences.
And can you talk about parental responsibility briefly?
Sure. So parents can be, actually, if their kid has committed a crime that owes somebody money, the parent can actually be held responsible for that money, that restitution. Also, the parents are also sometimes ordered to ensure that their kids go to mental health services, go to substance abuse. And the court can even put an order controlling conduct on them to ensure that they have those services in place. And also on the other spectrum, there are some criminal charges that relate to parents and their kids, particularly with failing to send them to school. If they're habitually truant, we can file charges against the parent for not sending them to school. Also contributing to condition of a minor if the parent is assisting the child in any delinquent activity or not supervising them appropriately, they could face criminal action under this charge.
And then very briefly, commitment. What gets a kid to commitment where he actually goes to a place?
Typically, it takes a while for a kid to actually be committed. Unless it's a very heinous crime, their first time into the court system, they're likely not to get put in commitment. Usually it takes being on probation for a while, violating that probation, having additional charges, and then the court just finally says, look, we've tried all the services in the community. There's nothing more the community can do. We need to try something more intense, which ends up being commitment with the Department of Juvenile Services.
Now, we're looking for success in these cases, right? And the whole thought of success is a kid who, we address the needs and the kid doesn't come back to us. And hopefully that's going to be the case in most cases. But we do see our failures, and our failures end up in the adult system. Fair to say?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. So I want to, running a little short on time. So I wanted to go back to some of our other panels with a couple of follow-up questions. Laura, thank you for that information. I don't think the average person understands how different the juvenile justice system is from everything else. So Antoine, if I could ask you, what is it that parents can do or should do to try to prevent their kids from being in the juvenile justice system in the first place?
One of the main things is we have a lot of good parents here in town, and they're doing the best that they know how to take care of their children. But unfortunately, with working, and we live in a society where parents have 2 and 3 jobs sometimes, children fall unadequately supervised. And that's one of the main reasons we found that our children are delinquent is because they're not being supervised, and not being supervised. As Corey said, they have idle time. And when they have idle time, they find things to do. And a lot of these times, they are the wrong things to do. So adequate and proper supervision.
Corey, once a parent finds their child in the system, what should they do? They need to hire an attorney, to go to the public defender. Should they put their kids in treatment if that's an issue? Start community service early? What would you suggest to the average parent?
So it really depends, Bill, on the nature of the offense for which they're being referred to us. What we do know is that a lot of kids, as I alluded to earlier, are identified early for mental health or substance abuse needs, and parents can do that on their own. They can take their kid to the local health department or local providers and get them engaged in those services early on. They don't need to wait for a delinquent act to occur. I think that's first and foremost. We also use our case managers, and we've got some great ones in Dorchester County, Miss Travers, Miss Tubman, and they're both supervised by Miss Williams, who I actually came to work for me back in 2006. She's now supervisor in Dorchester County, and a great one. They are always open to get on the phone with parents and talk about, whatever issues they're facing and try to point them in the right direction. We've gone as far, Bill, pre-COVID, was sitting down with kids and talking about, probably much like Antoine and the officers of CPD and the Sheriff's Department and Herlock do, about this road that they're going down and what could potentially happen. Honestly, this is now on YouTube. The parents can show them this presentation, and they can see exactly what can happen, but also all the great things that are happening in Dorchester County. I learned things tonight that I didn't know. The Police Athletic League, the cadet program. Those are exciting opportunities for the youth in Dorchester County. The Boys and Girls Club, those are all huge things that will help deter kids from entering the criminal justice system and my system.
Laura, in 10 or 15 seconds or less, what would you say is the greatest challenge you see in dealing with juvenile justice?
I would say probably the environment, the role models. A lot of our kids that we see maybe not necessarily have the best role models. So that's why mentoring programs are essential for these kids to come out of the life that they may have known forever.
I think that
And
makes
that's
perfect sense.
that's hard to combat sometimes.
So with that, we could talk all night, and I wish we had all night to talk about these things. But the bottom line is this: we want our kids to be happy and healthy. We want our kids to grow up into happy, healthy adults who live productive lives. And hopefully, through our juvenile justice system, the kids who get caught up in it, we can provide them what they need and make sure they have those happy, healthy lives. So I'd like to thank the three of you for joining us tonight. Not just for being here, but for all you do to make Dorchester a great place to live.